Who has measured the oceans in the palm of his hand? Who has weighed the mountains on a scale or counted the dust of the earth? Isaiah asks the question every heart must answer. Who is like our God? Nations rise and fall, rulers come and go, but compared to him they are a drop in a bucket and dust on the scales. The greatness of God cannot be measured, and the might of man cannot compare. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 12. Who hath measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, and meted out heaven with the span, and comprehended the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales, and the hills in a balance? Isaiah uses poetic questions of comparison to magnify God's greatness. Measured the waters in the hollow of his hand. Hollow refers to the small cup formed by your palm. The image. All the oceans, rivers, and seas fit in God's hand as if they were a drop. Meted out heaven with the span. A span is the distance between the tip of the thumb and little finger, about 9 inches. God measures the vast heavens as casually as we measure with our hand. Comprehended the dust of the earth in a measure. Measure refers to a container or unit of volume. God knows and holds all the particles of dust as if they were in a basket. Weighed the mountains in scales, and the hills in a balance. The picture of God placing mountains and hills on scales highlights his sovereignty over creation. What overwhelms man is like dust on a balance to him. Isaiah's imagery communicates God's immeasurable power and wisdom, contrasting it with human smallness. This verse reminds us of God's incomparable greatness. The oceans, skies, and mountains overwhelm us, but they are small in his hand. It challenges our pride. Humanity builds cities, weighs resources, and studies the universe, but compared to God, our knowledge and strength are like children with toys. This is also a comfort. If God holds creation so precisely, he also holds our lives. The God who balances mountains can balance our problems. It strengthens our faith. When we face things that feel too big, we must remember they are small before the Creator. Final takeaway. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 12 declares that God's power is immeasurable, his wisdom unsearchable, and his sovereignty undeniable. He holds oceans like drops, weighs mountains like dust, and measures the skies with his hand. When life feels overwhelming, remember, the God who holds creation holds you. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 13. Who hath directed the Spirit of the Lord, or being his counselor hath taught him? Who hath directed the Spirit of the Lord? The word directed, Hebrew, takan, means to measure, guide, or regulate. Isaiah is asking, who has ever given orders to the Spirit of God? No one. The Spirit of the Lord. This points to the divine wisdom and power of God in creation and governance. Or being his counselor hath taught him? Counselor, ish etzah, means an advisor, teacher, or one who gives guidance. The rhetorical question, who could ever advise or teach God? The answer is obvious, none. We often act as though God needs our advice, telling him how he should work, when he should answer, or why he should fix things our way. This verse humbles us. God has never needed a counselor. It reminds us that God's Spirit is self-sufficient. He is not guided by human wisdom, political power, or cultural trends. His plans are perfect from eternity. Practically, this verse comforts us. Since God's wisdom is flawless, his guidance in our lives is trustworthy. Even when his ways don't make sense to us, they are always best. It challenges us to submit. Instead of trying to counsel God, we should seek counsel from him through his word and spirit. Final takeaway. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 13 reminds us that God has no counselor, no teacher, no advisor, because he is the source of all wisdom. When we cannot understand his plan, we can still trust his Spirit. The one who guides the universe surely knows how to guide your life. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 14. With whom took he counsel, and who instructed him, and taught him in the path of judgment, and taught him knowledge, and showed to him the way of understanding? This verse expands the thought of version 13 with a series of rhetorical questions. With whom took he counsel? Did God ever sit down for advice or strategy? No, he acts from his own perfect wisdom. Who instructed him? The Hebrew verb bin means to make someone discern or give insight. No one has ever increased God's understanding. Taught him in the path of judgment. Judgment, mishpat, refers to justice, governance, or right decisions. God is the standard of justice. No one taught him fairness. Taught him knowledge, showed him understanding. These terms, da'ah for knowledge, tabuna for insight, underline God's completeness. He has never learned. He is eternal wisdom itself. Isaiah's point. God is not only all-powerful, version 12, but all-wise, VV. 13 to 14. He has no teacher, no advisor, and no peer. This verse reminds us of God's self-sufficiency. He doesn't consult experts, wait on research, or adjust based on opinion. His wisdom is perfect from eternity. It challenges our pride. Humanity often thinks we can redefine morality, truth, or justice. But true wisdom begins with God, Proverbs chapter 9 verse 10. Practically, this verse calls us to humility in prayer. Instead of telling God what to do, we should seek His counsel, trusting that His understanding is greater than ours. It also encourages trust. When God's path for us doesn't make sense, we can rest in the fact that He sees what we cannot, and His judgment is flawless. Final takeaway. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 14 teaches that God never needed instruction, guidance, or correction. He is wisdom itself. We don't shape His understanding, He shapes ours. When we can't trace His hand, we can still trust His heart. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 15. Behold, the nations are as a drop of a bucket, and are counted as the small dust of the balance. Behold, He taketh up the isles as a very little thing. Behold, calls for attention. Isaiah shifts the focus from God's wisdom to the insignificance of nations compared to Him. The nations are as a drop of a bucket, a vivid image. When carrying a bucket of water, a stray drop clinging to the rim is meaningless. All the might, wealth, and armies of nations are that insignificant before God. The small dust of the balance refers to the fine powder on ancient scales that made no measurable difference. Nations' power and pride are like weightless dust before God's throne. He taketh up the isles as a very little thing. Isles, Hebrew, ayim, means coastlands or far-off lands. Even remote, seemingly significant territories are nothing to Him. The phrase emphasizes His sovereignty over all nations and lands. This verse humbles human pride. Empires rise and fall, but before God, they are like a drop or dust, fleeting and weightless. It teaches us not to fear nations, governments, or world powers more than God. He alone rules history. Kings and armies are nothing compared to His sovereignty. It encourages believers to put their trust in God, not in political systems or human strength. Nations are temporary, His kingdom is eternal. On a personal level, what feels enormous to us, like the power of governments, institutions, or movements, is nothing before the one who rules heaven and earth. Final takeaway. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 15 reminds us that nations may seem mighty, but to God they are drops and dust. He alone is sovereign. Why fear man's power when God holds the nations like nothing in His hand? Isaiah chapter 40 verse 16. And Lebanon is not sufficient to burn, nor the beasts thereof sufficient for a burnt offering. Lebanon, famous for its vast forests of cedar and cypress trees, often used in construction and worship. 1 Kings chapter 5 verse 6. Isaiah pictures all its wood as fuel for sacrifice. Not sufficient to burn. Even if every tree in Lebanon were cut down and set aflame, it would not be enough for an offering worthy of God's greatness. Nor the beasts thereof sufficient for a burnt offering. Even if all the animals in Lebanon were sacrificed, it would still fall short. The idea, the vast resources of the earth cannot measure up to God's majesty. Isaiah's point, God's greatness cannot be honored by the scale of human sacrifice or offering. This verse humbles our view of worship. No matter how great our offerings, songs, or works, they can never fully express the worth of God. Worship is not about sufficiency but about surrender. It reminds us that God is not impressed by the magnitude of sacrifices but receives the heart behind them. Psalm chapter 51 verses 16 to 17. It also foreshadows the gospel. Only the perfect sacrifice of Christ, the Lamb of God, could satisfy God's holiness. Human offerings, however vast, could never be enough. Practically, this encourages us not to measure worship by size or show but by sincerity. Whether little or much, true worship points to the infinite worth of God. Final takeaway. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 16 teaches that no forest, no herd, no sacrifice on earth could ever measure up to God's greatness. Only Christ's sacrifice is sufficient. Our worship is not about matching God's worth but reflecting our awe of His majesty. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 17. All nations before Him are as nothing, and they are counted to Him less than nothing, and vanity. All nations before Him, this is comprehensive. No empire, no group, no alliance of powers can stand as significant in God's presence. Are as nothing, the Hebrew word, ayin, means absence, emptiness, non-existence. Compared to God's eternal being, nations have no lasting weight. Less than nothing, a striking phrase, showing insignificance multiplied. Nations that seem mighty to us are, to God, not only nothing but even less than nothing. Vanity. The Hebrew tohu means emptiness, chaos, or worthlessness, used in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 for the formless void. Without God, nations are fleeting, unstable, and meaningless. Isaiah's imagery reminds us, the greatest powers on earth, in God's view, are temporary, weightless, and passing. This verse humbles us in a world obsessed with political, military, and cultural power. No empire, no matter how strong, has eternal standing before God. It calls us to place our confidence not in nations or leaders, but in the Lord who rules them all. Trusting in governments for ultimate security is like leaning on air. Personally, this verse helps put perspective on our fears. What seems unstoppable to us, nations, systems, movements, is nothing before God's sovereignty. It points us forward to the eternal kingdom of Christ, Daniel chapter 7 verse 14, which will outlast every earthly power. Final takeaway. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 17 declares that before God, the nations are nothing, less than nothing, and vanity. Human power is fleeting, but God's reign is eternal. Don't fear the rise and fall of nations, fear the Lord, whose kingdom never ends. Nations rise and fall, mountains crumble, oceans shift, but our God remains unmatched. He needs no counsel, no teacher, and no rival. He measures the seas in his hand and calls the nations less than nothing. Remember this. When life feels overwhelming, the one who holds creation holds you. Who is like our God? No one. If this word lifted your faith, don't keep it to yourself, share it. Hit like, subscribe for more living word teachings, and comment below. No one is like our God. Let's glorify him together.